Well, welcome back, Bible scholars. Today we turn our attention to the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, a tradition often misunderstood and yet deeply relevant, especially for those of us in the Unitarian Universalist tradition who care really deeply about justice, compassion, and spiritual authenticity. When most people hear the word prophet, they tend to think of fortune tellers, figures who could predict the future, especially dire predictions like disasters or the end of the world. But that's a misunderstanding shaped more by popular culture than by the Bible itself. In reading the Bible again for the first time, Marcus Borg invites us to see the prophets not as predictors, but as poets of social conscience. Poets of social conscience. Voices crying out in times of crisis, challenging the injustice of their day with fierce moral clarity. So, let's begin with the context. The prophetic books in the Hebrew Bible span a long period of time, from roughly the 8th century BCE to the 5th century BCE, and they fall into two main categories. The major prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, which most people have heard of, and the minor prophets, which is a group of 12 shorter books from Hosea to Malachi. But don't let the word minor mislead you. Their message is anything but small. In fact, it's pretty intense. What unites the major and the minor prophets is not fortune-telling, but a passionate concern for justice, fidelity or faithfulness to God's covenant, and the ethical treatment of people, especially the vulnerable. Let's think of the prophets as public theologians. They weren't part of the religious establishment. In fact, many were outsiders. They were often very unpopular, even persecuted, and that's kind of part of their power. They dared to speak out against the ruling class, the priests, the kings, and even sometimes the people, when society strayed way too far from its moral compass. And here's where Borg makes a very critical point. To understand the prophets, we need to recognize two central patterns in their message. First, they speak truth to power. They speak a lot of truth to a lot of power. They name and confront injustice directly. Economic injustice, political corruption, and religious hypocrisy, and they really don't mince any words. Listen to Amos, for example, who rails against those who trample the poor and turn justice into bitterness. Or Micah, who we looked at a little bit in this course, who famously declares what God requires: to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly. So I'll say that again, one that links our treatment with one another. This is not a privatized spirituality. This is a public ethic, one that links our treatment of one another with our relationship to the sacred. And I'll say that one more time, one that links our treatment with one another to our or with our relationship to the sacred. Second, Borg emphasizes that the prophets combine judgment with hope. Yes, there are a lot of warnings of exile, warnings of destruction and suffering if the people refuse to change their ways, but there is also a vision of restoration, of returning to justice, and a renewed community living in harmony with God's dream for the world. That's a tension we're invited to hold. The prophetic voice is not just critical, it's also imaginative. So not just critical, but also imaginative. It critiques the present in the name of a more just future. Now, you might be wondering, how do the prophets relate to us, especially as Unitarian Universalists? After all, we, as Unitarian Universalists, don't often talk very much about covenants with God in the same way the prophets did. So, why should we care? Well, let's bring this forward just a little bit. So Borg invites us to see the prophetic tradition not as something trapped in the past, but as something we inherit and continue. The prophetic spirit is alive in anyone who speaks up for justice, who challenges the status quo, who calls out hypocrisy, who dreams of a better world. All these things. That includes voices like Theodore Parker, who we've talked about, who said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Or another famous Unitarian Universalist named James Luther Adams, who insisted that we are not saved as individuals, but only as we are part of a community committed to justice. In our own congregations, in our specific congregation, in our own work for climate justice, racial equality, reproductive freedom, LGBTQ plus rights, and even more. We embody this prophetic spirit. I think we embody it quite a bit. We don't do it to earn favor from God, of course. We do it because we recognize that the sacred is intimately bound up with how we treat one another. The sacred is intimately bound up with how we treat one another. So Borg also urges us not to domesticate the prophets. Their message is not safe. It's not tame. It's meant to disturb us, especially those of us with power or comfort. Prophets are not polite guests at the table. They flip the tables when justice demands it. In that sense, prophets stand in stark contrast to a kind of religious life that avoids controversy, that reduces spirituality to personal comfort. The prophets call us back to what Borg describes as the political meaning of faith. That doesn't mean partisan politics. It means remembering that faith always has public consequences. Always has public consequences. This is especially relevant in our time when religious language is often used to uphold injustice, all the time in fact, to justify inequality, nationalism, and exclusion. The prophetic tradition reminds us that true religion, in the biblical sense, is not about maintaining power at all. It's about dismantling it when it becomes oppressive. So, as we reflect on this chapter, I invite you to ask yourself, who are the prophets of our time? Who is speaking hard truths? Not because they want to win an argument, but because they believe in a better future. And what would it mean for you to speak prophetically? Not necessarily with a bullhorn, but with clarity, courage, and compassion. What would that mean? What would that look like? So let me close with this. The prophets were not perfect people. They had doubts, they felt fear, some tried to run away from their calling. Think about Jonah and the big fish. But what they shared was a willingness to be vessels of truth, to say what needed to be said, to imagine what could be, and to risk being misunderstood. In that sense, maybe every Unitarian Universalist, everyone who dares to stand on the side of love, is called to be a little bit prophetic. Not because we're better, not because we know everything, but because we believe that the world can be better and we're willing to help make it better. I'm looking forward to our discussion that's about to start in just a second.